Hello everyone, welcome to my class. Once again, this is Oliver Perater, and today's discussion would be the Deontology ethics of Immanuel Kant. Deon in Greek means duty or obligation. This is why Deontology ethics is also known as duty ethics. Immanuel Kant has more than one treatise on his moral notions, but this lecture video is mainly based on his book known as Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, translated from French into English by James W. Ellington. There are actually several translations, but this is the only translation I'm a bit familiar with. Now, some other translations are using groundwork instead of grounding.
Immanuel Kant, who was born in 1724 and died in 1804, is considered to be the most influential thinker of the modern time. Modern philosophy emerged upon the twilight of the medieval thinking, or should I say, the beginning of the fall of the medieval thoughts. Medieval philosophy represents the ideals of the feudal society Europe. This was the time when the businessmen were not the wealthiest people in the world. The wealthiest were the people who were lording over thousands and thousands of hectares of lands. They were known as the lords, the counts, the dukes, who commanded thousands of armies of its own. And of course, as the wealthiest, they took control of politics. In fact, some of these lords turned out to become the kings, or at the very least, ministers of the feudal politics. But the most powerful institution at this period was none other than the Christian religion. In fact, this epoch is also known as the Christendom.
In general, the life and morality at this period were mainly based on obedience and loyalty. Note that a society which is mainly based on obedience is a society which does not require too much thinking. A feudal society had self-sufficient economy. It means they had economy which was enough for itself. They had everything they needed within the kingdom. And the products they had were the same products produced by some other kingdom. Hence, export and import of goods and services were not that vital. And of course, businessmen could not flourish the way they do today. Kingdoms were generally living in isolation. And isolated economy would also mean isolated mindset. People did not know too much about some other kingdoms. A very good condition for any religion to flourish and establish power. But everything started to change during the epoch known as the mercantilist period. Spices from India, silk from China, blue-colored pigments from Afghanistan were just few among the commodities considered to be luxurious in the European world. It was also when these European merchants started to flourish and little by little establish economic power. But these merchants did not only traded goods and services, but also consequently traded information as well. Different cultures and traditions, different religious belief, different ideals, different cuisines, and all sorts of lifestyle from many parts of the world had become talk of the town in Europe. This epoch drastically changed the mindset of the European world that led to Italian Renaissance and the Age of Reason or Enlightenment. It was when the new breed of thinkers started to emerge and question the political and religious practice of blind obedience, loyalty, and absolute power of the authorities. In general, the Italian Renaissance and the Age of Reason was an invitation for us to use our minds and our senses instead of simply ruling over on commands and impose rules. The ideas were spread that in general, people also possess intelligence and are fully capable of decision making as much as the lords, the kings, and church leaders. And therefore, people's opinion and political decisions must also be respected.
In Kant's ideas, it was the Copernican revolution of mindset. Instead of simply following the rules from the outside imposed on the self, one has to acknowledge the power emanating from within the self, because humans have intrinsic power from within. In his essay, An Answer to the Question What is Enlightenment, Kant invites people to go back to the self, use one's own reason, stop relying too much on someone else's guidance. In the first paragraph, he says,
Enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity is self-incurred if its cause is not lack of understanding, but lack of resolution and courage to use it without the guidance of another. The motto of enlightenment is therefore, sapere aude, have courage to use your own understanding. Kant synthesized the early modern rationalism and empiricism. Both of these schools of thought are outcomes of the age of enlightenment, and both had generated ideals and principles that run in contrary with feudal religious teachings. In general, rationalism, represented by René Descartes, argues that all knowledge can only be acquired with the use of pure reason or pure thinking without the need of any of our senses. Meaning, Descartes believes that we do not need our senses in order to know the truth. While empiricism, represented by George Berkeley, John Locke, and David Hume, claims that all knowledge is derived from sense experience. That is, no knowledge can ever be acquired or produced without the use of at least one of our senses. This gave rise to the modern scientific experiment the way we know science today.
Now, while the debate between rationalism and empiricism progressed, Kant intervened, claiming that both are just two sides of the same coin, that there is a knowledge which is acquired prior to experience using only pure reason, but there is also a knowledge that can only be acquired after experience with the aid of the senses. He classifies these two knowledge to be a priori and a posteriori.
A posteriori knowledge is a knowledge acquired after experience. All scientific knowledge produced from experiments are examples of a posteriori knowledge because these knowledges are impossible to achieve without experience and without the aid of the senses. We know colors because we see colors such as blue or red. But those who were born blind would never have any idea what colors are. Again, this is another good example of a knowledge a posteriori, or a knowledge that we acquire after experience. But those who can never experience them can never know them. Let's say, for example, not all metals are solid. This is true by virtue of the scientific discovery that mercury is a liquid metal. Had it been not discovered, then most likely people would still believe today that all metals are solid. Another very good example is the scientific fact that the Earth is only one of the planets revolving around the Sun. Now, this was only discovered after Galileo Galilei's daring inquiry using his improvised telescope. Thousands of years before Galileo and before his discovery was proven to be true, it was a church doctrine that the Earth was the center of the universe. It was taught in almost all schools, if not all, in Europe, that the Earth is the center of the universe, and that the moon, the stars, the sun, and all other planets are revolving around the Earth. And to claim against it was considered as blasphemy and punishable by death or at least imprisonment. In fact, Galileo Galilei spent the last days of his life in house arrest.
Now, again, these are examples of knowledge we can only acquire after experience with the aid of the senses, or a posteriori. Like, I know a bird because I have seen a bird. I touch, I smell, I hear, I taste a bird. And I know the sound of a bell because I already heard sound of bells. And these are another some examples of knowledge acquired a posteriori, or after experience.
But in Kant's teaching, not all knowledge can be acquired this way. There is also a knowledge that can only be acquired prior to experience, or a priori. That is knowledge we could gain without experience. In fact, they can never be known by seeing, tasting, touching, smelling, and hearing them. They can only be known by pure reason or pure thinking, devoid of any experience. There is knowledge that can never be experienced with the aid of the senses, like pure mathematical equations and numbers. Numbers can neither be seen nor touched. This and this, and the verbal word three are nothing but symbols of the idea of number three that exists only in the mind. All of these are nothing but representations of the idea of number three in the mind. Numbers do not exist in space and time. Now, let's talk about morality. How do we know that telling a lie and not keeping promises are morally wrong? And how do we know that giving and helping people in need are morally good? In Kant's teaching, one does not need experience in order to know these moral principles. We could know their moral worth even without listening to other people or religious leader, and even without reading any scripture. We could learn them by ourselves. As rational beings, we have the internal capacity to know the principles of morality, and that we have the intrinsic capacity to identify right from wrong. This means that knowledge of the principles of morality can be acquired only a priori, or prior to experience, just like mathematical equations.
If you are fully capable of knowing the principles of morality a priori, then it implies that you can be a good person even if no one is telling you what to do and what you should not be doing. Human intellect is capable of knowing right and wrong even without being told, even without commandments and imposed rules. As human beings, we could know that lying, not keeping promises, and murder are morally wrong by virtue of a priori grounds. We do not have to experience murder in order to know that murder is wrong. On the other hand, we would know that helping people in need is morally good even nobody is telling us. In the grounding, Kant argues that all moral concepts have their seat and origin completely a priori in reason. They cannot be abstracted from any empirical, and hence merely contingent cognition.
Immanuel Kant acknowledges this, should I say, human capacity or power. As a human being, I should not be told what to do and what I cannot do. And I should get rid of any imposed rules on me by any authority. That is, I should exercise autonomy of the will. Every rational has this power, and we should exercise autonomy, since, just like all kings and church leaders, we are fully capable of knowing and understanding. In fact, some of us probably could even do better than kings.
You know, maybe this is also one of the reasons why Kant did not try to find a lover. I don't know, but lovers sometimes do control each other. They impose rules on each other. They change the way you dress, the movie you should watch, the music you should listen to, the friends you have to hang out with, the food you should eat. They would try to change everything about you. And yet, at the end of the day, they still leave you anyway. They still leave you anyway.
Hello?
Baby,
Yeah, baby.
sorry.
Sorry for what?
I need to leave you.
What?
You have changed a lot.
Oh yeah? I believe it was you who changed me.
It's the motherfucking Eagle Double G. Snoop Dogg.
Among many questions in ethics, asking the question why one should do good is of equal importance. Kant, directly or indirectly disagreeing with virtue ethics, natural law theory, divine command theory, and even utilitarianism, which also emerged during the modern period. Do good and avoid evil, not because it is what God commands, not because it is your nature or inclination, Not because you expect something in return as a reward. Not because you want to be happy. Do good and avoid evil because it is what you ought to do. Gumawa ka ng mabuti dahil yan ang nararapat mong gawin. As rationals, it is our duty. It is our obligation. Kant says, this duty prior to all experience is contained as a duty in general in the idea of a reason that determines the will by means of a priori ground.
But it is only reason that could oblige us. If we have to follow command, it should be the command of reason. The law that dictates what we ought to do and what we should not do. And it is the same reason that gives us the capacity to know the principles of morality a priori. In Kant's another book dedicated to elaborate his moral teaching, he says, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe. The starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. In his book Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant says, there is no possibility of thinking of anything at all in the world, or even out of it, which can be regarded as good without qualification, except a good will. In simpler terms, it means that there is nothing in this world, or even outside of this world, that we can call good except the goodwill. Helping people, saving lives, voluntarism, and the likes are not really good in themselves. None of this is good unless it emanates from the goodwill. What is goodwill? In general, human being has two general faculties, namely rationality and will. Rationality gives us the capacity to know, while will gives us the capacity to choose.
Will is commonly translated in Tagalog as loob. Like in the Lord's Prayer, your will be done is translated as sundin ang loob mo. In Cebuano, it is buot, like matuman ang imong pagbuot. Loob literally means inside or within. Remember that the principles of morality can be discovered a priori, or we could know them without the senses. We could know them from within. The Cebuano word buot means thinking or rationality. Like when one says, uy, buutan naman ining bataan eh. It means this child already possess intellectual capacity. Or when one says, wa kay buot, it means you do not possess intellectual capacity. We are capable of knowing the principles of morality a priori because we are rational. Buot is also the root word for the Cebuano word buutan, which means a good person. Somehow, in this sense, rationality and morality are closely related. And I find it pretty much similar with Kantian tenet.
Goodwill then is translated as mabuting kalooban in Tagalog and maayong kabubuton in Cebuano. Now, anything that is bad for Kant is bad. But some actions we consider to be good may not really be good if they do not emanate from the goodwill. Saving a person from drowning may not really be good if it were tainted with some other motives. The only thing that is good in itself is the goodwill. The goodwill is something internal to us, and it is the most important metric or determinants of the moral worth of an action. So it is internal then that Kant is concerned with more than the external ones.
Now, remember Kant's book, Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals. Meta in Greek means beyond. So metaphysics literally means beyond the physical world. the world that cannot be known through the senses. So in giving alms or helping, the concern is not really the actions, because actions can be seen. The most important thing is the motive why one gives or helps, which can never be noticed by the senses. For instance, most religion, if not all, consider helping to be good, along with almsgiving and saving lives. But in the teaching of Kant, none of this is good in itself. Because even a person who has hidden motive could give, help, and save lives. If your helping does not really come from your goodwill, it is not really good at all. Ang totoong kabutihan ay manggagaling sa mabuting kalooban. Ang tinuod nga kaayo magagikan sa maayong kabubuton.
Hence, for Kant, an action is not really the only thing important here, but the motive of why the action has been done. The motive which is internal cannot be seen, and yet is the most important, while the action which is external loses its good value without good motive. The invitation is to do good and avoid evil even without a reward and even without being told. Real goodness comes from the inside of the self. In fact, goodwill is intrinsically embedded in every rational. Kant says, for when moral value is being considered, the concern is not with the actions, which are seen, but rather with their inner principles, which are not seen.
Keep in mind that Kant is concerned more on the internal or inside of the self rather than on external or outside of the self. In order for an action to be truly be considered good, it must not be grounded on any external motive or influence. If John is helping the poor because he wants to be in heaven someday, he is not really a good person because he expects a reward. The idea is do good without expecting anything in return.
If Paul does not murder because Paul only obeys God's command, then Paul may not really be a good person. What Paul would do if there were no commandments? Do you think he can still be a good person if God did not give him commandments? A real good person is the one that does what is right even without being told. If you do good because virtue is required for happiness, you are not really a good person. The same thing when you do good because you want to be in heaven someday.
If you receive a package through a particular courier, you might say thank you to a mailman. But the most appreciation you would give is to the one who sent the package. The mailman was not really acting according to his own initiative. He was only doing it because he follows order and he gets a reward out of it. Furthermore, for Kant, the highest good is not happiness, but the goodwill. It is the only thing that is good in itself. Do good even if it doesn't make you happy at all, or even if it will give you undesirable outcome. The point is, do good and avoid evil regardless of the circumstances and regardless of the outcomes. After all, in Kant's precepts, your experience doesn't matter that much. In fact, it doesn't matter at all.
In his book, Critique of Pure Reason, Kant says, and allow me to read.
This is Critique of Pure Reason by Cambridge, translated and edited by Paul Goyer from University of Pennsylvania, and then Alan Wood from Yale University. So we are looking after B835. I assume that there are really pure moral laws which determine completely a priori, without regard to empirical motives, that is happiness. The action and omission, that is the use of freedom of rational being in general, and that these laws command absolutely, not merely hypothetically under the presupposition of other empirical ends, and are thus necessary in every respect. Since every rational could possess the knowledge of the principles of morality a priori, then it follows that human beings deserve to exercise autonomy of the will. That is, I should rule myself. I should be ruled by nobody, and I should rule myself. I don't have to be told what to do since by virtue of my being rational, I have the internal capacity to know what is right and wrong, even without being told. Thus, human does not need anyone's law or dictate in order to know and do the good. Autonomy of the will is when the will in choosing good deeds is free from any dictates of external influences such as orders, rewards, happiness, and any external motives.
Contrary to this is the heteronomy of the will. It is when someone's will is imposed on you in doing actions and choices, making you unable to act according to your own will and without someone else's directives. We have distinguished two types of will, the autonomy of the will and the heteronomy of the will. Kant also identifies two types of imperatives, the categorical and hypothetical imperatives. So when you say imperative, it means law. Hypothetical imperative is any law which has external influence like king's or God's command, external to the person. It could also be a law created by the self but with influence from the outside of the self, such as influence by a reward or punishment or good outcomes or happiness or whatever, anything that is external.
The law that Kant promotes is the categorical imperative. It is the law that the self has crafted for itself, not influenced by any external motives, commands, or rewards. Kant believes or teaches that we can be our own lawmakers. Categorical imperative are unconditional laws. These should be obeyed without conditions. That is, regardless of your status, gender, sexual preference, situations, and existential conditions. Categorical imperative is the only source of authentic morality, while hypothetical imperative, on the other hand, is the source of fake morality. Because hypothetical imperative is a law that others made for you or a law that you made but out of the influence of external forces that consequently make your good action unattributed to you. Contrary to categorical, hypothetical imperative is conditional. The if and then.
Sige, sasagutin na kita, pero
Pero,
Pero,
mag-aahit ka na araw-araw.
puptulan mo ang buhok mo.
sumama ka muna sa church namin.
Bawal ka na sumama sa barkada mo.
Run.
Pa-member ka muna sa networking downline ko.
You see, the basis of their choices are relying too much on external factors and not really coming from their goodwill. In Kant's tenet, the idea is legislate your own law, free from any external temptations and dictates.
But many people fear that if everyone makes its own imperatives or laws, it would lead to chaos. But Kant already offered a solution to prevent this problem from occurring. We should not only craft any imperative without considering its universal validity. Kant says, act as if the maxim of your action were to become, through your will, a universal law of nature. Consider, for instance, the following maxims. I should not keep promises. First. Second, I should not murder. Third, I should lie. Fourth, I should not lie. Then after making these maxims, you need to make some sort of thought experiments to know whether this could become universal laws. You have to think the scenario by which every one person follows the same maxim as you do. That is, like you, they also don't keep their promises. then not keeping promises becomes our moral obligation or duty. Hence, everyone should always not keep their promises. But for Kant, this is self-defeating. If everyone follows the same imperative, then no one will believe in promises at all. This sort of imperative cannot become a universal law, and therefore it cannot be your moral obligation or anyone's moral obligation. It self-destructs. So the same thing with lies. The maxim "I should lie" cannot become a universal law, because if everyone has the duty to tell lies, then no one will believe in words at all. On the contrary, it is the maxim that "I should not lie" that has universal validity, and therefore it could become a categorical imperative, which is not only universal but also absolute. Universal because it applies to everyone, and absolute because it doesn't change through time. That is, lying is always wrong in the past, today, and through all eternity. On the other hand, if you make the same thought experiment with the maxim "I should not murder," everyone would certainly find it easy to craft the same law for themselves. Thus, the maxim "I should not murder" has universal validity. And therefore, it should be everyone's duty never to murder. Now, let's take a good example. You are standing at the gate of your house, and suddenly your father from nowhere came in, grasping for breath, and immediately entered into your house. Few moments later, three people with guns are rushing towards you asking questions like,
Have you seen a bald short man with eyes very wide open, very skinny like drug addict with a tummy bloated as if he was 8 months pregnant?
and immediately you recognize those descriptions belong to your father. And in your sane mind, you really believe that those people are going to kill the most handsome father you got. And yet they have questions that need to be answered. What are you going to do? Would you tell them lies to protect your father? Now take note that one of your duties is to never tell a lie because it is bad regardless of your experience. And Kant invites us to do good and avoid evil always and everywhere. Lying is lying, and it is wrong, no matter the circumstances. After all, life is not about happiness, but about doing the right thing, even if the outcome is not desirable. Maybe you can grab one of their guns and shoot them one by one. It is also a moral thing to do. Protect your family. Or you can simply run away. But never tell a lie regardless of the consequences. Do good even if it doesn't make you happy at all. Do the right thing even if you are going to hell trying. It's not about the reward. It's not about your experience. It's about your duty to do good and avoid evil. It is observable that Kant gives emphasis on the self over others into becoming authentic moral person. However, it doesn't mean that Kant gives no regards for others the way René Descartes did. Others possess similar rational capacity and moral ascendancy. Thus, they must be treated with dignity. They are objects of respect. They are ends and not simply means or utilities. In Kant's words, he says, act in such a way that you treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, always at the same time as an end, and never simply as means. In other words, others must be the purpose of the things we do, and they should not be utilized to meet our ends. That is, one should not inflict pain to any person even for the pleasure of majority. Of course, Kant did not really say that we cannot utilize other people. Every time I eat rice, I utilize the farmers. When I watch performances, I utilize the talents of some people. But when my interest runs in contrary with your interest, none of us deserve to be sacrificed. Treat humanity as ends, never simply as means. Kant's teaching have had huge impact not only during the modern age but even until now. From the academe to politics to democratic notions, internationalism, business, and even in medical world. The principle of autonomy, for instance, helps us figure out that patients' autonomy must be respected no matter how much expertise the medical practitioners possess. During the medieval period, for instance, wounded soldiers had been amputated despite of their oppositions, but it is no longer the case now.
The autonomy of the patient in decision-making for medical procedures is highly observed and is essential. Autonomy is one of the most important ethical fundamental principles being applied in the medical field.
Autonomy basically means freedom or independence, or letting the patient decide for his or herself, letting him decide on which course of action, medical treatment, or medical procedure to take, given that the patient is informed about the said procedure, its benefits, its possible risks, as well as its alternatives or options.
In every medical procedure that we perform, we ask for the patient's consent. Basically, that means that the patient would have the right to decline any procedure that they are uncomfortable with.
They have the right to decide whether to undergo a certain procedure ordered by his or her physician.
As a medical practitioner, it's my part or obliged to inform and educate patient before performing any invasive procedure in operating or delivery room.
It is our utmost responsibility and primary role to provide the patient with the right and adequate information needed for them to know and understand the risk and benefits, the possible complications, the consequences, the reasonable alternatives to their proposed intervention. As medical healthcare professionals, we should ensure that the patient is well informed with regards to their condition. Thus, this will enable and help the patient to explore the choices and to examine the choices, for them to know and for them to have their own health care decision with regards to their condition.
There are also times that the nearest kin or the legal guardian of the patient decides for them, especially if the patient is a minor, is in coma, or the patient does not have the mental capacity to decide for himself.
There are cases that autonomy are being suspended for patients who are minor or having a mental illness or drunk.
And thank you very much. And thank you very much for watching until this very moment. I hope you've learned something from this lecture video. And please subscribe and click that small bell down there. So, shout out pala to the YMCA Davao.